So let's begin with websites. Websites are really key to establishing a so-called web presence. Almost all the other tools we're going to be talking about, their role is to drive prospects and customers to the site. So that's obviously the place we need to start. We'll be discussing a bit later about how, in fact, you can conduct so-called e-commerce on the internet without a website. But I choose to flip the question the other direction and say, why wouldn't you want to have a website? Why wouldn't you want to have a mechanism so that you could describe in your own words to prospects and customers 24/7 why you are the best source for the goods and services that your businesses provides? Well, the first step to a web presence is a web address. And these so-called domain names, you get them by going to outfits called registrars. The most popular is probably one called GoDaddy due to Danica Patrick. Hover's another one. And there's plenty of others. In fact, almost anyone that you're going to subsequently be talking about hosting your website, they also will register you as well. Typically, it's going to cost you $10 to $15 a year. Not a big deal. So what's a good web address? Well, the KISS principle still applies, although in this case it stands for keep it short, stupid, rather than simple, because you got to remember that someone's got to type this web address in precisely for them to find your website. Likewise, as much as possible, you want to make your address got to be memorable because they got to remember it. If your business name is taken, then try to think instead, use some keywords that describe your business. Hyphens are allowed, but we would suggest that you avoid intentional misspellings, like don't be so cutesy things like using you instead of YOU, because remember, they've got to remember it. The other thing you're going to need to do is to try to find an appropriate so-called domain name extension. These domain name extensions, strictly speaking, they're called top-level domains. The idea behind them originally was to try to give somebody going to a website a general feel for what that website was about. So by far and away the most popular top-level domain is one called .com, and that's what you always want to try to get for a business. Now .net originally started out to being for a domain that was for people that were in the internet business, like the AT&Ts or the Yahoos or the Verizons or so on. But it's turned out to be used by more and more people as an alternative to .com, along with .biz, which is a newer choice. And there are tons of others. .org is the global standard for not-for-profits, like SCORE. There are also so-called country codes, like the .us, which in the U.S. is primarily used by veterans organizations and the like. Although in other parts of the world, like in England, probably the majority of their websites end with .uk, I suspect because they want to make sure their customers know that they're dealing with a true blue Englishman and not those lousy Europeans. And then, as we mentioned, there are all kinds of others. .tv has become popular for use with web videos. There are things like .coop if you're an agricultural co-op. Continue to evolve with these additional so-called TLDs. But .com is the one that you want to try for. Okay, so you got your web address. Now you got to start thinking about what are you going to put on your website. Now, most small businesses start with what I would call a brochure site. By that I mean it's got the kind of content that you would have classically found in one of those multicolor trifold brochures that businesses used to print up and hand out, and we still do. So for a brochure site, usually there are 5 basic pages. The so-called home page or landing page primarily consists of just an overview that tries to have some attractive content that steers people to their subordinate pages, notably the one that relates to products and the services, where you describe what you got to sell and why you're the best, etc. There's then also typically pages about the so-called About Us page It's got the background of the owners or how to contact us and so on. Then there's typically some material like testimonials that's really trying to answer the question of why we're the best at providing those goods and services. And then lastly, there's a bunch of material to try to help out your customers. It may be things like frequently asked questions or manuals or contact forms or so on. Our main message is don't get hung up on the content. Everything can be updated as needed. Just get something out there. So let's go over that process in a little more detail. The home page, primarily just a bunch of enticing blurbs that are going to try to steer people down to the next level of your website content. The most important of which is your products and services pages. This is typically 3 to 5 categories of what you have to offer, what are the benefits of your key features, what's your pricing delivery, and we do suggest that in general you organize your website, outline it, so that it's wide and not deep. And that's why, for example, we said 3 to 5. There's no point in having just one product and services page that immediately then breaks out into 3 subordinate pages, because you just force the viewer to go one level down before he finds any content, and they don't like that. A variety of studies say users don't really want to go more than about 3 to 5 levels down, and they hate back buttons. So that's again why it's important that this level always be accessible no matter where you are. So 3 to 5 categories, not 1, not 10. Next, some people prefer building in the why us to the products and services pages, but I personally prefer to see it highlighted, because you need to be able to articulate what are your discriminators, what is your niche, if you're going to make anybody believe that you're the best provider of these products and services. So it also includes, you might have a subpage on testimonials, maybe another subpage that consists of a bunch of Ask the Experts. For example, I had a cyber client out in the Midwest that sells plans for wooden children's toys. Over the years, they've developed a whole host of training material that is accessible by their clients. You might have one on, here's how you clamp things together so that you can cut out 5 wooden cars at once on a bandsaw. The point is, what are your unique tools and traits that's going to be attractive to your users? And in addition, some of you may be not-for-profits. For a not-for-profit website, you'll also typically find grouping of web pages that are, say, okay, if you happen to have an old clunker you'd be willing to donate to us, or here's a link to a PayPal. If you could contribute, we'd appreciate it. And then, as we just said earlier, it might be called customer support, it might be called customer service, it might be called help. But this is where you're going to find things like frequently asked questions, where you might find things like installation videos. I'm sure all of you have seen the some assembly required instructions that were obviously written by someone who did not have English as a first language. Nowadays, though, what you're going to find is that those have been supplemented by videos, which customers really like, because you can show them that, well, hey, this is the long screw, not the short one, and you have to get into it from the right rear. You might have a page of helpful links. If your project related stuff, you might show some samples or specifications of typical projects. And then you'll find a collection of material under the heading of About Us, management backgrounds, principal contact email addresses for whoever does sales or marketing or customer service in your company, maps and directions, and that type of stuff. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about something called meta tags. Meta tags are the way somebody who develops a website has to tell the search engines what their website is about. And there are 3 primary forms. One's called a title tag, then there's a description meta tag, and a keyword meta tag. Now, the title meta tag is as its name implies. It's what you find at the top of your browser where you can, that describes what the content of that page is about. And you write that. The search engines will use what you say, or the browser will, to display that up there. If you don't say anything, it's just going to say Internet Explorer. But if you provide it, it'll be up there at the top of the browser and just burning in through the eyes of the potential customer about what that page is all about. So you want to make it attractive to what you think their interest will be. And then the description meta tag, as the name implies, is if you're lucky enough to show up in the result on a search engine, you probably notice once you go beyond the web address, the so-called URL, then there's 25 words or less. And if you fill out the description meta tags, the search engines will still use your description. So this gives you the way to, again, make it as enticing, focused on what you think the customer's interest in keywords is, to attract them to click on your link instead of some other link on the search engine result page. And lastly, there's a so-called keyword meta tags, which the current search engines, the big boys at least, except for Bing, frankly, nowadays ignore. And the reason they ignore it is that too many people lied. So what they do nowadays is they actually review the content on the web page and they decide what is the keyword in that content. Now, we say keywords, they're actually phrases, but I still advocate that you should fill out those keyword meta tags, even if Bing's the only one that's going to pay any attention to them, because you need a reminder to make sure that you put those keywords down there in the body of that content. Now, some rule of thumbs, the keywords can still be phrases in titles and descriptions and what are called headings, but in the body, they have to be in full grammatical usage. That is, you can't just list a keyword 100 times, which was another way that people cheated for a while, but instead, it's got to be in a full sentence with a subject and a verb, and preferably an object, and yes, the search engines actually do check grammar. Okay, you got your site organized, you know what your messages are, and now you just got to develop some content to deliver those messages on each of your selected web pages. And there's three principal ways you can go about it. First, you can do it yourself, and I contend that, particularly if it's just a so-called brochure site, that as long as you can use a word processor like Microsoft Word, you really don't need help from anybody else to be able to develop an effective, attractive, affordable brochure site. The primary downside of those kind of tools that make it easy for you to do is that they may be a little restrictive in some of the fancier features that more powerful tools can provide. And whether it is because you need some of those more powerful features or you're just uncomfortable doing it yourself, the other two choices are obviously to either hire an individual or to hire a company. In either case, my primary advice is that you make sure that you can talk about not only what the sites that they develop look like, but how either the individual or the company wants to work with. A lot of people, understandably, prefer working with someone a little closer to home that they can deal with, in many cases, face-to-face. Companies, on the other hand, will tend to have more support options, more features, although they can become extremely expensive. So now we're about creating some content. As we've already discussed a couple of times, you've probably got all the material you need in the business plan that you wrote to obtain financing to create a brochure site. Invariably, the content of those 5 key pages that we talked about are in that plan. If that doesn't work, you can just talk to some people to get some ideas about what to write. Some rules of thumb: 300, maybe 500 top, but definitely not 1,000 words per page. And another good rule of thumb is about 50 words per paragraph. Otherwise, the page gets really kind of wordy and users find it hard to read. The other thing is users really do like photos. Actually, they like videos even more. But for a website in particular, you don't really need an photographer, because your smartphone has got plenty of resolution and quality for website images. But if you just don't have the image that you want, you can't find anything where you can take it yourself, you can also purchase stock photos reasonably cheap, maybe $5 a photo for some decent stuff. Now, If you're doing it yourself, almost all the big boys in web hosting business like GoDaddy and AT&T and One-on-One is another good one, all have easy drag and drop design templates that, again, if you can use Microsoft Word, you can use their tools to develop an effective and attractive site. I've also listed a couple of other sites, one called Wix and one called Weebly. I've been recommending Weebly for years, and one of their notable advantages is that they are developed in so-called HTML5, which is the latest browser display standard. And what's important about that is that when you code in HTML5, you get both a website that's geared toward a desktop computer and a website that's geared for mobile devices like smartphones. Now, Wix and Weebly have the further advantage that they are free to mostly free. You know, at worst, they're like $4 a month. So cost is just not an issue. But for that matter, neither is it for the big boys who've all, like AT&T, they've reduced their prices lately, so they're all in the 10 to 20 bucks a month. It's just, that cost is just not an issue regarding development. However you do it, we've mentioned several times that it is important nowadays that you have a mobile version of your site too. And that mainly means that the pages are arranged so that they reflow the text and pictures such that it doesn't require a lot of horizontal scrolling on a smartphone. Many of the do-it-yourself builders, as we've already discussed, include this either automatically or as an option. You're typically looking for things like click to call, clickable maps, click to make a reservation, click, click, click. You get the idea. It's designed for ease of use on a phone. Once you so-called publish the site by either your developer or using the do-it-yourself tools, you then got to still do some classical, I'll say, marketing using traditional techniques, like you make sure that that URL, that web address, is on all your brochures, your business card, your billboards, your letterhead, anywhere that you mention anything on your receipts, etc. And in addition, we're also going to be talking here in a few minutes about using social media in various forms to, in effect, drive people to your site, because you just want to mention that site whenever you can in any of the postings you make on social media. There are some other factors you also may want to consider. In particular, we advise that you do not leave your hosting with your developer. Unfortunately, there have just been too many examples in the past where some developers acted like they were not really a service for hire and that they, in fact, own the copyrighted material that constitutes your website rather than you. So just to put that issue aside and make it clear up front that, yes, you're going to pay them to develop it, but you're going to host it with somebody else. And there are plenty of them out there. We've already talked about One-on-One and AT&T and GoDaddy and so on, tons of hosting, all generally competitively priced. We've also sort of beat to death the need for mobility features, but probably spend a couple minutes talking about some of other things. We've already mentioned that users like videos and large photos, but you got to worry about them because 20% of the U.S. is still on dial-up, and large photos are going to take tens of seconds to download. And users just won't wait that long. Rule of thumb, they prefer it to be a web page to load in a second, but 3 to 5 seconds tops. And what that means is you have to use a little trick called thumbnails, which is either a small version of the photograph or a screen grab of the video that will load fast and satisfy their initial load. Now, if once it initially loads, they're still on dial-up, they know that when they click on that photograph to get the full detailed version, they're going to have to wait. But that was their choice. They won't wait initially. Another design rule that you should think of is that you always want your important content to be, using an old newspaper term, above the fold. And by that we mean typically when a web page loads up, the entire web page isn't visible on the screen. Instead, typically, you'll have to scroll some. The point is you want to have your important content visible on that initial screen, corresponding to being above the fold of a newspaper. Next, we want to talk about using data regarding user interaction with your website, so-called analytics, to develop some insights into their interests and needs. I should note we're going to be using the example of Google Analytics, which is a free service from Google, but almost all the other search engines like Bing or Yahoo or Ask, and the other social media sites like LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter all have analytic tools as well that allow you to assess how prospects and customers are interacting with your sites. So, at least as groups or classes of users, analytics lets you answer the questions about who's coming, where they're going, where they're coming from, and when are they showing up, what do they do as they migrate through your site, and then finally, where and how do they leave. So this is a typical Google Analytics dashboard. It happens to be my local chapter in Pasco, Hernando County in Florida. And in that case, we get about 30 new visitors a day. About 60% of them are new, and the other 40% are either returning clients or our local volunteers checking in, reporting interactions with our clients. About 20% of them are on smartphones, and that number just keeps getting bigger and bigger. They tend to stay an average of about 3 minutes or so. One of the things we're interested in, because we service these local 2 counties, is we're tracking what cities are we getting the most visits from and so on. Perhaps most interesting thing is the type of traffic that we're getting. About a third of our traffic are so-called direct visits. And by that, it means that somebody typed score439.org into the URL, on a browser, or more commonly, they probably hit a favorites button or a bookmark. But they typed in our web address directly and came to our site directly. Then another third are so-called organic visitors, and as a result of a so-called organic search. You might also call that free search, because that's what happens if somebody just types in, say, Pasco score into Google, and our web address would come up as one of the choices, and they clicked on us that way. And then about 20% of the people are so-called referral sites. They came from things like at the SBA or maybe a local chamber, or it turns out, as far as Google's concerned, Bing and Yahoo and AOL are also referral sites. But regardless, they came to us not through a search engine per se, but from another site. And then we'll get to this in more detail later, but we actually buy paid search engine advertising on Google. It's a feature called Google AdWords. And it turns out about 10% of our visitors come from that source. About 100 of the 900 visits a month are from paid ads on Google. Now, in fairness, it also turns out that we also run paid ads on Bing, and we get about 100 from them as well. And we used to do paid ads on Facebook, and also got about 100 each. We'll talk in a minute about why we elected, based on some feedback, not to stay with advertising on Facebook. But Bing and Google are kind of equally effective as far as we're concerned regarding getting us paid visits. And overall, it's about 20% of our visitors each month. And then the other thing we do is we make use of, as we'll be discussing in more detail in a few minutes, the so-called email newsletters, and about 10% of our customers come from that source as well. Now, one of the things that we also like then to look at is what's called bounce rate. It's a bounce when somebody comes to a web page and then immediately leaves and doesn't go to another page on your site. So we wanted to look at what were some good sources for us so that we could try to cultivate them. And it turns out our best source, which is the lowest bounce rate, was actually email newsletters. The people that came in from our newsletter we put out in September 2013 actually had a bounce rate of only 20%. By the way, numbers like 50% are typical, so these are all good. And of course, our volunteers coming back, they're going to have a pretty low bounce rate too. So, and it turns out, again, Bing and Yahoo and AOL, they all seem to do reasonably well for us too. Now, if you kept going down this list, back in the days when we were advertising on Facebook, you'd have found that the Facebook visitors had bounce rates up in the 90% range. And so, yes, we were getting 100 visitors a month, but none of them were sticking. None of them were going anywhere other than the initial page. And so after about a year or so, we finally decided that that just wasn't a productive source for us. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate Facebook as an advertising media. It could very easily work effectively for you. It just didn't for us. More notably, what the point I'm trying to make is you don't have to speculate about it. You can let the numbers teach you, speak for themselves. Another effective tool in the analytics quiver is a so-called visitor flow analysis that in effect lets you track visitors' interaction throughout the website from where they came from, where they first go, then next page, next page, next page, and you can keep going as long as you wish. Now, Google offers a variety of choices as far as the parameters that you can track. In this case, we've chosen to track the same grouping we did on the dashboard regarding traffic type. So we've broken the visitors down into were they direct, i.e. they typed in score439.org, or hit a bookmark, or did they type in Pasco score, in effect, and get a free search result, or were they a referral from something like the SBA, or did they come in from an email newsletter, or were they part of our paid search ads, and so on. You can see that most of the people, regardless of the source, whether it was direct or organic search or referrals, they tend to all end up, as you'd expect, on the home page, although you will notice, and you'll see why later, that most of the email source actually went directly to a local workshops page, because that's what we mostly send out email newsletters about. Then it turns out once they hit the home page, they split as you might expect. Some of them go to workshops, some of them go to our tools and resources tab, some of them request mentoring, and so on. And you can break these additional pages down in more detail if you wish. Now, what the red signifies the so-called drop-off rate. That is, the people that came in here, this many dropped off. Actually, in most of these pages, it's not too much to worry about, because 50% number is kind of typical for a good site and a good page. You really only want to start worrying if things get beyond about 80 to 90%. You really want to start asking some questions about looking at that page's content to make sure that what is there about this page that's so unattractive that they're leaving the site rather than going somewhere else instead on our own site. There's also a special circumstance in that because of the way our websites are arranged, when somebody goes to our local workshops page, if they want additional detail or to register for one of the workshops, they actually have to leave us to go to another website called Constant Contact, which is what we use to schedule events. So these larger drop-off rates for local workshops are not something to necessarily be all that worried about. So you can use this to wander through to see which pages are more attractive. Once they start down a path, where do they stay with it, or do they sort of wander around? You can also then use it to actually go in further detail to investigate the differences between the behavior from different sources. For example, let's see if we can figure out if paid ads that we're running are worthwhile. So now we're looking in detail at the 90 or so visitors, about 10%, again, each month that we get from paid search engine ads on Google. And you'll see that the bulk of them go to our home page, as you'd expect, although some did go directly to request a mentor. But most of those that went to the home page, in fact, then went to what's called our Tools and Resources tab, where they can find various links to other sites and downloadable templates and tools and business plans and samples and so on. Some went to local workshops, some were requested mentoring, and some went to, I think this was About Us, and then they in turn went to local workshops, and they in turn went to online workshops. But you can see how people walk through the site. Now, most of the tools and resources people actually ended up going then to a specific downloadable tool called Business Plan Made Easy, written by one of our volunteers. A lot of small business owners found helpful, particularly in their initial planning of their business, and so they either found it attractive or downloaded it, or they left. So you've just seen how we can observe the behavior of the people that clicked on our search engine advertising. One question that obviously comes to mind is, were they doing what we had hoped for? And it turns out the answer is no. What we'd hoped for, because of the services we provide, we mostly had hoped they were going to be requesting mentoring, or they were going to be looking and registering for our local workshops, because to be honest, that's the way we kind of get graded as an organization by our national organization and by the SBA. We don't get any brownie points because we make downloadable tools more accessible to business owners and managers like yourself. So let's see if we can figure out why that happened. This is the most popular search engine advertising mechanism. Is something called Google AdWords. Again, almost all the other search engines have similar kind of features that, particularly if they deal with keywords, allow you to do very similar things. But the way search engine advertising works is you basically go into Google and say, look, if somebody comes in to your search engine and types in these kind of phrases, we'll pay you up to, in our case, $3 per click for anybody that selects that keyword that is located in our case, Pasco and Hernando counties of Florida. You can limit it down to a single zip code, or you can make it the entire world if you got that much money to advertise with. Up to a total of $6 per day in our case, up to a total of so much per month. Now, we have to limit our advertising budget because we actually fund our advertising through grants from banks, because while the federal government generally provides us enough funding locally to operate our chapter, we don't have any funding available for outreach. So TimesScore has been called the best kept secret in small business, and we'd like to be a little less secret than that. And so we've gone to primarily the banks have been gracious enough to provide us some grants that we use to advertise our services to small business owners and managers and make people more aware of them, of what we have to offer and have available. So now what happens then is that as clients come in, this shows the results over a period of a month. And we've got, as I recall, about 80 to 90 different keyword phrases that we've put in, we're in effect an auction bid for. And as you can see here, we've said, all right, we'll pay you up to $3 per click. And here's a rank ordered list of what the customers were interested in. Not what we hoped they were, but what they actually cared about. And it turns out the most popular phrase was one called Small Business Plan Template. We got 23 of the 91 visits that month from paid ads were for that, with what's considered very phenomenal so-called click-through rate of almost 5%. 1% is considered grape in the search engine advertising business. It cost us a little less than $2 a click, and we tend to average about $2 a click. So you can't take that as we happen to be playing in an arena where we're competing for these ads with profit-making companies. They're selling business plans and franchise opportunities and so on, and so they're willing to pay more money than we can. But so it costs us generally about $2 a click. Although one of the things we do is you manage things so that what's called your average position. Now, by that, I mean if you know how Google search results work, there's 5 listings off to the right of the page. The free stuff is over to the left. Now there's some even more expensive paid ads at the top, but we're just cheapy stuff on the right. And there's 5 of them there, and you're wasting your money if your bid's high enough that you're in the #1 position, because all 5 of them are equally visible. So you want to have a so-called average position of about 3.5, and we're doing okay in that regard. During that month, the point I want to make to you is that we got those 91 people from a total so-called impressions of about 6,500. Now, it turns out that we could have had 5 times that many impressions and probably 5 times that many click-throughs if we had an unlimited budget. The problem was, again, we have a $6 a day limit, and we're paying about $2 a piece. So if you're the 4th person that day to come in with one of these keywords, you won't get an impression because we've already spent our budget for the day. But another point to note is that even if we'd had an unlimited daily budget, there's still another 6,000 impressions that we would have never gotten because basically we were overbid. And for example, you look down here on the 4th entry, it seemed like a very effective phrase for us, starting a small business. We did get 6 click-throughs on that different times during the month, but on the particular day this report was run, we couldn't get on the first page. But Google is nice enough to show you that, hey, if you wanted to be on the first page, you had to bid at least 3.25, not $3. Now, one of the results of all of this was then a soul searching about, is this a good investment on our part? Because it's not getting brownie points from national, because almost all the topics are either plans or ideas, i.e. people looking for immediately downloadable stuff. They're not searching for mentoring, they're not searching for counseling, they're not searching for workshops or seminars. They're looking for online tools that can help them right now. But you're going to hear in a few minutes that the real theme of almost all this type of marketing on the internet, the goal of it is to establish your business as being a helpful and trusted provider of the goods and services. It's not selling per se. And we finally concluded that people were finding us helpful, and they will remember us when they use that downloaded business plan and decide they need some help or want to attend a workshop, because we were there to help them with their plans and templates and ideas and so on.